In Canada, there's this idea that if you work hard, you can make it. The Great North version of the American dream.
What happened where people go out and work hard to realize that dream?
And that's always been a bit of a cheat though, since obviously not everyone starts with the same opportunities. But the idea is still here. Take the results of a recent survey that asked thousands of Canadians about what it takes to succeed.
So the vast majority of people are telling us, well, hard work, education, and ambition are key to getting ahead.
But there's at least one group that's starting to feel like maybe hard work isn't all it takes to really make it.
If we look at, say, young adults, they're much less likely to say that.
I think the idea that, oh, hard work will get me wherever I want has really declined over the years, especially with how society has been going, who gets the tax breaks, who gets sort of saved from the problems, because it's certainly not, the middle class or the average person, right?
Do you think it's harder to move up in life than it used to be?
I think that there are new ways that you can kind of pursue and go out on your own.
It's easy to take the pessimistic route and say that, it's never been harder, and I think that's an easy thing people have said before, but I don't think it's harder, but it seems harder.
It's just about the cost of living going up, and it's hard to kind of get jobs now compared to how it was even before the pandemic, compared to how it was maybe even 20 years ago when I was 5.
The Canadian dream may be a thing of the past.
I've got no more fight left in me. I've worked too hard and too long.
I did my best to delve into a complex soup of graphs and calculations to try to answer one seemingly simple question: is it getting harder to get ahead?
When are things going to improve?
Anybody would be foolish to predict it exactly.
For better or worse, a lot of people have this idea that they should do better than their parents. That idea, moving up the socioeconomic ladder, how much income levels can change from generation to generation, it's called social mobility. And economists do pay attention to this. That takes on the form of convoluted numbers and calculations. But let's take a look at something called the Great Gatsby Curve.
Gatsby. He had a grand vision for his life since he was a boy.
And yes, it's a reference to the F. Scott Fitzgerald novel set in the 1920s. Unless you're an economist, you've likely never heard of it. The graph shows the connection between income distribution and social mobility. Various countries are lined up on the graph using these two measurements. The UK and US rank as the most unequal and least mobile, while Nordic countries are on the opposite end. Canada sits somewhere in the middle. The graph visualizes how more inequality is associated with less mobility across generations.
I think if you're middle class, what you expect, what you assume is that no matter where you end up in life, that the game was fair. My name is Miles Korak. I'm a professor of economics at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and a longtime follower of Canadian public policy and economics.
Korak studies intergenerational income mobility. His research forms the basis of the Gatsby curve.
When we were speaking about the definition of the middle class, part of it has to do with being treated fairly. And so social mobility speaks to our sense of the importance of equality of opportunity, that everybody or anybody can make it in life.
Compared to other countries, Canada is relatively socially mobile. But how does social mobility in Canada compare across time? In other words, is it easier to move up the income ladder now or harder? There's been some work to look at upward mobility over the decades, but here's a caveat, and it's a big one. They only go up to a certain date. You can't exactly measure outcomes when we're still living them.
If you're born in 2000, you're only, just about 24. You're too young for us to be looking at your income in any meaningful way.
Connolly has researched upward mobility for Canadians born between 1963 and 1985, basically Gen X and some of the eldest millennials.
Income transmission has gone up, meaning like mobility is lower. It is harder to move up and down the income distribution. You're more stuck where you were born. It's not to say that there's no mobility at all, but there's less than there used to be.
Where mobility typically freezes up in Canada is outside the middle class.
For those in the bottom, say 40%, the bottom 20%. The intergenerational cycle of poverty in Canada has become more severe.
So while far from flawless, Canada is and remains a relatively socially mobile country. But there are gaps in what we can measure, especially more recently. while at the same time, some people feel something is certainly off.
We're seeing significant economic shifts and changes in like the structure and nature of the workforce. My grandfather worked for one company from his entire adult life, from turning 18 until the day he retired. Whereas everybody that I know, they kind of jump between jobs because that's the only way in order to move up and get raises. So I don't really feel like folks my age have the same opportunities that we used to.
From hearing how my parents got by in school and found jobs, it seems like they had not an easy time, but it was doable. And it seems a lot more daunting now.
A certain malaise amongst the middle class. Even if you're doing well, you feel that the future is much more uncertain.
Korek says in an era of growing inequality, that means there's a lot of room to rise and fall. And that variability means luck plays a factor. Like when someone joins a successful startup can make a huge difference. But there's also the fact that a dollar just doesn't go as far as it used to.
When you talk about the frustration, it's not just how much iron versus, my neighbor or, me in relationship with my parents, but it's also what I can get from that income, right? And so it's a purchasing power, or how much is left in my pocket after I spend it on housing and food and, all those other necessities.
One big shift between millennials and their parents, home ownership. It's been on the decline for more than a decade, especially among the youngest age groups, as housing prices climb ever higher. So even if some people feel they're in the same socioeconomic class as their parents, they might also feel like they're poorer than them.
Housing nihilism is, I think, an increasingly prevalent attitude, especially among younger Canadians, which is just this kind of death of the dream of homeownership.
What takes the biggest bite out of your earnings? Rent and food.
1 or 2 generations ago, it was totally reasonable for people to expect that if they got a job, they worked hard, they saved, they skipped the avocado toast, they would be able to buy a home. And maybe it would be small, but maybe they could leverage that to buy a bigger home down the road.
A study of the same issue in the US found on average, millennials aren't actually worse off than their parents, but something is getting worse: the gap between the rich and the poor. It might feel like folks are worse off now because 40 or 50 years ago, even a low-paying job could pay for the basic necessities and some big-ticket items like a house. But now those same jobs are barely enough to get by. In other words, the poor are getting poorer. But that's not all. Income inequality has been a problem here in Canada.
Are we more polarized, meaning a smaller middle, or less polarized, meaning a bigger middle? And until the late 80s, and certainly by the 1990s, we were becoming less polarized, and then we became and continued to be highly polarized.
But there are signs that income equality is improving in Canada. According to one key measurement, that peaked 20 years ago and has improved since.
It's increased a lot between the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and the turn of the millennium. And there was a massive increase in inequality, and it sort of peaks 2003, 2004, around those years. Since then, it's actually gone down.
So while big picture economics don't paint some financial doomsday scenario, a lot of people are still feeling like they've been shortchanged.
Do you think you have less opportunity than your parents? Oh, I don't know if it's less opportunity, it's just that there's less to go around.
I'm surviving. I'd like to do more than survive. People deserve more than survive.
I think that Canada it's just changing what middle class means, and a lot more people are in that sort of poverty area. So no, I don't think anymore looking at Canada, I see middle class. I see people struggling and working as best as they can.
The fact is the numbers can only tell us so much at this point. Millennials are still very much living out their lives, and we can't know where they will land. But a big change is on the horizon as wealth, assets like savings or property, moves from one generation to the next.
Wealth is tremendously unequal in Canada. There's going to be, over the next 10, 20 years, major transfers of financial resources across generations. And it's happening now. That is going to be playing out increasingly over the next decade or two as the baby boomers move on to the next phase in their lives. It's going to play out in a way that's going to bring social mobility into question and the basically the luck of the draw, the luck of whose parents you have, is going to determine your station in life.
Make sure to check the description below for our sources and more useful links about this topic.